We began the actual content of Genesis last week, and I stated then how we should view the chapter. How should we look at Genesis chapter 1? That's a good question in light of everything that's said about Genesis chapter 1 from all kinds of sources. The answer is we should view it exactly like Moses, the author of Genesis through Deuteronomy, told us to view it, as God as the creator over all creation. That's how we should look at it. God as the creator over all creation. The whole world was originated in God. God keeps the world going. It's all about Him. And so we should recognize Him for who He is and give Him the glory that's due Him. So my ultimate purpose in Genesis, the book of Genesis, working through Genesis 1, is to give God the Creator the rightful place, the place that Genesis 1 gives Him. Now sadly in Genesis 1, usually you hear something else presented other than that's God glorifying, because it's usually attacked on several levels. Now you probably have many questions in your mind about Genesis chapter 1 or Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And I don't have all the answers to those questions. As a matter of fact, the Bible doesn't answer all those questions. And I have many questions. When I read the Bible, I have tons of questions about all these things. And I just trust God by faith that I know He knows what He's doing. I'm not sure I know what I'm doing much of the time. I know He knows what He's doing. So I trust Him. Now, if you want a more scientific, I'm not here to give you a scientific analysis of Genesis chapter 1. There are people who do that kind of thing. If you want a more scientific analysis or clarification of Genesis 1, I suggest you go to the websites that you know about, Answers in Genesis, Institute of Creation Research, Creation Research Society. My brother's a part of Creation Research Society. He says that was the first one started and that everybody else borrows from them. They did the research, all the other guys borrow from them. I don't know. They have tons of articles on all these sites, and you can read a lot of good things from these guys. What our focus needs to be is what Genesis actually says. What does it actually say? We can speculate all we want, but what we need to do is look carefully at the wording of Genesis chapter 1 to see what it actually says, so we understand what God's agenda is, not the world's agenda, not an agenda I imagine in my own mind, but what is God saying here? And we'll do that as best we can. So let me give you a roadmap. At least this is the roadmap I designed for us to follow. And hopefully it's in line with Genesis 1. So I should have done this last week. I didn't do very good on giving you the roadmap I want you to follow. I want you to see the whole picture here. With the thought that the God of creation is the prominent theme in Genesis 1. And technically, by the way, it goes from Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, this section. Let me give you this outline. I'm going to lay down 6 truths in that regard. By the way, there's notes in the back if you haven't got those. And also, we've started, Sandy helped me with this. I want to give the kids a little something here to help them along the way. So we have a little paper we made for them with a verse on it, and they can draw things like clouds and stars. If you adults want to draw the clouds and the stars, we'll give you one of those papers as well. And maybe I should be using that up here, right? Anyway, I'm going to lay 6 truths down in regard to the subject of God as the creator. And here they are. First of all, the God of creation is the eternal God. Secondly, He's the triune God. Thirdly, He's the all-powerful God. Fourth, He's the saving God. Fifth, He's the all-wise God. Sixth, He is the good God. That's all going to be in Genesis chapter 1. We're going to highlight the God of creation first and foremost, as I've been stressing the last couple of weeks, and then what He created. And in a separate message or two, I think I'm going to talk about some of the attacks on the God of creation in Genesis chapter 1. We're not going to spend forever in the first chapter of Genesis, but some amount of time. Now, last week, we began by stating that the God of creation is the eternal God. Scripture says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We talked about that, and verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and so obviously He existed prior to creation. So He's eternal. Secondly, He's the triune God. We saw that last week. The Father, Son, and the Spirit all participated in creation. We looked at that subject last week. Then we started speaking about the all-powerful God. None but God could create the world, number one, and do it in 6 days. He could have done it in the blink of an eye, but He chose to do it in 6 days for certain reasons. And as we consider our all-powerful God, we are going to look at each day of creation under this heading. We're currently speaking of the first day of creation. That comprises verses 1 through 5. Let's read verses 1 through 5 as we look about on day 1 of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was moving or hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. So you see the structure of Genesis 1 is all around those 6 days of creation. And if you make it something else, then you break up the 6 24-hour days of creation. Now, verse 1 is not just a title to the chapter. It's not just a summary of the chapter. It is the first part of the first day of creation. And like we said last week, when you look at verses 1 and 2, especially verse 2, as he begins to create the first phase of creation, it's maybe like a person. Let's read verse 2. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So it's like a person who's taking a lump of clay. A lump of clay is not shaped at all, and then a person has my wife used to have a potter's wheel, and she would take a lump of clay, just a blob, put it on the potter's wheel, and work that clay until after some period of time it formed a beautiful bowl. And you look at it and you say, well, this is amazing. And as I said last week, if I try to do that, it would still be a blob of clay when I got through. But she's a great artist. So the Lord chose to shape and fashion and create the world, the universe, in 6 days. Now, we have to understand that verse 2 is setting the background for verse 3. So when you look at verse 2, it talks about the environment of planet Earth upon the first phase of creation, first day. It was formless, it says. Formless, meaning kind of like a wasteland. Not much there to brag about. It was void, meaning it was empty. That means without inhabitants, nobody there except for God. It was dark, and Moses is not talking about darkness as in a spiritual metaphor. He's not talking about darkness as illustrating evil here or falsehood. 1 John 1:5 says, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. That verse speaks to the issue of God's holiness and truth versus evil versus sin and falsehood. But Genesis 1:2, we're talking about the context of Genesis 1:2, speaking of the physical phenomena we call darkness, cosmic darkness, the lack of light in space. So verse 2 is the earth is formless, it's empty, without inhabitants, it's dark, it's water saturated. Notice verse 2, darkness was over the surface of the deep, it says. Then it mentions the Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the waters. And the deep and the waters are one and the same thing. The basic meaning is these are deep waters. And so what you have when God begins to create, you have this wasteland that's dark and it's watery everywhere, deep waters. Exodus 15:8 uses that same word, the deep, to describe waters that can drown people, as a matter of fact. It's this primeval ocean that surrounds the earth, that underlies the earth at this time, in this phase of creation. That's the beginning. These are the conditions that the earth is in. When God says the first words in the Bible in verse 3, what does he say in verse 3? Let there be light. That's the first thing that's said in the Bible by God. Again, this is physical light in contrast to physical darkness. No need to spiritualize this as some have done. We don't need to do that. This is physical light, physical darkness. What exactly is this light? He just says, let there be light. What exactly is the form of this light? Because the sun does not appear until day 4. There's no sun here in day 1. That's not until day 4. So what is this? Well, the Scripture is silent on the matter. And anything we say is speculation at best, although that doesn't stop everybody from speculating over the centuries. And so a lot of guesses have been made. What is this light? God said, let there be light. What's he talking about? Some people say, and these are in your notes, I think, some people call this a manifestation of God's glory. Maybe it was. Some people say maybe this light was the original source of the pillar of fire. Remember the pillar of fire that led Israel later on? Maybe this was the original source of the pillar of fire that later became the sun. A third option that people have guessed at, maybe these are angelic beings acting as luminaries, acting as lights. Maybe that's what the light means here. Others have said this is an unnamed temporary light source. Now we do know this in Revelation 21:23. When it speaks later on of the New Jerusalem, it says The city had no need of the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God has illuminated it, and its lamp is the Lamb. What was that light source? Well, that was the Lamb of God, right? Illuminating New Jerusalem with the glory of God, a tremendous thing. That's what it says in Revelation 21. But the fact is, in Genesis chapter 1, it only says this, let there be light. It doesn't tell us exactly, so I can't give you a definitive view. Obviously, the light came from God. We know that much in some way. And there's a big debate about what it was. I do know this. On the first day of creation, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And that's really all we need to know. There was light, however he did it. God can provide all the light necessary to illuminate the entire world. He's spoken into existence, and he goes to show that he doesn't need the sun or the moon or the stars. He can have light from emanating from himself or him being the source or whatever he did. He's all-powerful. That's what we're talking about, the all-powerful God in the 6 days of creation. Now, one thing for sure, God is happy with the form of that light in Genesis, in day 1. Even if a lot of people that you read about are not happy with it, God is happy because verse 4 says, God saw that the light was what? The light was good, right? God's happy with it. Now, that term good has to do with the quality of the work God did. The quality of the work he did and the purpose that it accomplishes. Let me ask you this. Did this light source get the job done? Yes, because verse 3 says that light, verse 3 says that the light dispelled the darkness of verse 2. What is God's opinion of that? He says, this is good. The light is good. And so God is like an artist who steps back and looks at his painting and says he's pleased with it. This is going really good at this point. In fact, it's going perfectly good. That's his evaluation, and that's good enough for me also. And then he gives names in verse 5 to the light and the darkness. The light he calls the day, the darkness he calls the night. Now, that's another indication of God's authority over creation. He's authoritative over creation because he gives names to it. And, you know, if you create something, if you make something, if you invent something, guess what? You have the right to name it. I'm going to call this my great invention. That's whatever. You're the one that made that decision. You made it. You can call it whatever you want to. And God does this. Notice in verse 4, there's the division or separation. This is the first of 3 separations. One in verse 4, one in verse 6, one in verse 14. Here in verse 4, God separates light from darkness. Now verse 5 says, and there was evening, and there was morning one day. And you see this same refrain throughout the entire chapter for 6 days. Evening and morning one day. That's the first day. This verse plainly teaches us that evening and morning makes up one day. If there's an evening and a morning, then there is a nighttime. And if there's another evening and morning, there's a daytime. And so it goes on like that continuously. Now, if you're just reading this normally, in its normal flow, you're not going to think anything but that's just a day and a night, 24-hour day and night. And we'll talk about this later. It doesn't matter that the sun has not been created yet. Some people make this argument, well, the sun hadn't been created, so how can this be a 24-hour solar day? And the fact is, because God said it's day and night, he said this is day 1. That's why. And so before and after the sun was created, it's called a day. Now, we'll deal with that 24-hour day business in Genesis 1 at a later day, a later 24-hour day. We'll deal with the 24-hour day. We'll talk about that. And we'll also revisit verse 3 later on, okay, at another point, not tonight. For the time being, I just want to focus on what happened on each day of creation. That's day 1. Look at day 2, verses 6 to 8. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. Each one of these verses mentions the word expanse. I used to read this. You know, I'm not a scientific guy. I'm not into science. Dr. Jeffrey West over here, he's the scientist over here, okay? Talk to him. And so I don't have that scientific mind going. And so these kind of things, when you read this for years, the firmament, what's the King James, I used to read the King James, the firmament, what's the firmament? What is all this expanse and all this going on here anyway? King James calls it the firmament. Verse 8 of this lets us know what the expanse is. Look at verse 8. It's heaven. That's what it says. This is heaven, not the third heaven, but rather the atmosphere. We're simply talking about the atmosphere. Some translations call this the sky. It's what humans see above them. They look up and they see the sky. They see the atmosphere. Now, what does that contain exactly? And that's another question. The expanse contains the birds of the sky, for one thing. Why do I know that? Look at verse 20. Verse 20, then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. So that's part of what's going on. You look up in the sky, oh, there's birds flying. That's part of the expanse. Also, there's what we might call the outer space. Look at verse 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. So these lights, it goes on to say, are the sun, moon, and stars. So that's also part of this atmosphere, this expanse. Now, the word expanse means something that is beaten out or spread out like a covering. Psalm 104 verse 2 says God was stretching out heaven on creation. He was stretching out heaven like a tent curtain. Just a descriptive account of creation. How did this atmosphere come into existence? Once again, God spoke, and it happened. It happened. Now, verse 7 talks about the waters below the expanse. Well, the waters below the expanse or atmosphere, those are the seas. And the water above the expanse are the clouds holding water, probably. There's a big debate about that, too. I'm going to leave this for the scientists to talk about, but generally speaking, the waters below are the seas, the waters above are the clouds holding water. Now, there's a lot of discussion about that, okay? I'm not going to get into all that. Again, you can find information on, answers in Genesis, or you can read 1,000 articles about this if you want to. Knock yourself out. At the end of the day, in verse 7, it says this, and it was so. It was so. Now, I have something written in your notes on that phrase. I would ignore that for the time being. I have to check that again. Meaning this, it happened just as God designed it to. And it was so. It happened just as God designed it to. And that phrase is going to appear 5 more times in this chapter. And it was so, and it was so. When God created something like He said it would, it did like He said it would. And He does no halfway job of creating anything. Now, it's interesting that we read Psalm 19 this morning in our reading up here. Psalm 19:1 says this, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. So when you look at the sky, it's proclaiming this. Look at the sky. And it's saying this, God made me. It's because of His handiwork that I'm here. He did this. He did this amazing job. When you look in the blue sky, or you see the birds in flight, or you see stars at night shining bright, think of that song, This Is My Father's World. This is my Father. Well, His hands, the wonders wrought. He worked all these wonders with His own hands. He did it. It's His work. It's an amazing work. The expanse is designed, created by God to give Him glory. Let's go to day 3. That's in verses 9 to 13. Now, there are 2 acts of creation on this day. 2 acts of creation. First, verses 9 and 10. Verse 9, then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters He called seas, and God saw that it was good. It talks about the waters below the heavens being gathered together in one place. Verse 10, the gathering of waters He called seas. That's plural. What does this mean exactly? Good question. Read 100 different people, and you'll get 100 different answers. Not being the scientific mind, I read this on Answers in Genesis. They say, because this water went into one place, it seems that God created one great big ocean and one great big continent. And that's what it seems to say. And he goes on to say it wouldn't be until the flood that we would get 7 continents that we have today. The flood changes everything, by the way, in relationship to certain things, in relationship to Genesis 1. So they say that. Another source says that the seas surrounded the dry land on all sides, and into which the waters of the lakes and rivers flow. Or another way you could say this is that what happened was the dry land that appeared was like an island surrounded by the seas. So think of an island surrounded by seas, and a lot of people think that's what happened. The thing is, we really don't know. Nobody was there to see it. Whatever the situation was, then was not the same as our present, since it all changed after the flood. Okay? Now in verse 9, the Lord also said, let the dry land appear. Now wouldn't you like to have a video of this? Wouldn't you like to see this happening? This would be the biggest hit on YouTube ever, to see all this happening. The dry land emerging, this transformation taking place, the earth coming out of the deep waters and emerging somehow and going to, however it happened. A lot of people think that there was one continent anyway to begin with, and it came from there. And we're not going to talk about tectonic plates and all that right now. So, whatever happened, nobody knows for sure. But once again, the power of God is staggering. And Genesis doesn't go into all this information. What appears out of the watery deep is not, and here's another interesting thing. What appears out of the watery deep here is not wet land. That should come out, right? It's all wet. It should be all wet. What comes out is dry land. There's no process of time of drying mentioned at all. It didn't take any time because what came out immediately was dry land. There's no mud. You don't see any mud coming out of here in Genesis 1. It's all dry. Amazing. Dry land appears, and it says, and it was so. It was so. God, confirmation that this is exactly what God created. God names, again, the land, the dry land, earth, and the water, sea. Of course, his evaluation is that it was good. I should probably inform you that our church is one of the dinosaurs, pun intended, in the world today. We actually believe in 6-day, literal, 24-hour day creation. And there's good reasons for that, by the way. And there's many holes in the evolutionary theory that can be that are there that they need to deal with. But a second activity that happens on day 3 is in verses 11 to 13. Look at verse 11. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind. Notice that phrase, after their kind. And trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. Again, that refrain, again and again. Vegetation, it talks about here. Vegetation is, in this verse, is kind of an umbrella term, a category that has 2 subcategories listed under that, and that would be plants and trees, plants and fruit trees. And that's going to prepare the way for animal life and human life to follow. Notice God says, let the earth sprout vegetation. Now, we're not talking about Mother Earth here, or Mother Nature. We're not saying, you know how people say to you, well, Mother Nature does things this way. Mother Nature does things that way. And I'm thinking, what do you mean by that? I know what they mean by that, but there's no, as if it was some kind of a deity, and it's not. The earth is not responsible in and of itself for producing vegetation. God enables it to produce vegetation. He's creating this in Genesis 1. It's his doing. So first there are plants yielding seed, or we could say herb. The word can mean herbage, yielding seed, and then fruit trees. We also have the first occurrence of the word seed here in the Bible, which is very important in the Scripture in many contexts later on. Even in Genesis later on, it's a very important word. And we'll talk about that as we go on. So you have this word seed. Usually the word seed carries the meaning of offspring, as if one had children. And here it's obviously the seed of a plant or the seed of a fruit. So God created, think about this, he created the plants and trees to be fruit-bearing, to be that way, to be seed-bearing, I should say. And these plants and trees are full-grown. That's another thing. They're full-grown at creation. God is not like a farmer who sows seed and day one, and then or the third day of creation, and then all of a sudden, it takes time for it to grow. It doesn't do that. These are made this way originally, created with maturity. They have the appearance of age. They talk about the appearance of age, rather on the third day. They're full-grown plants, full-grown trees. They're equipped to produce other plants and other trees. Again, notice that phrase, verse 11, and other times, after their kind, after its kind. See that again and again. I think it's found 10 times in Genesis 1. Gives heavy emphasis to the idea. This is everything that's procreated is after its kind. Always comes after its kind. Now, Bible-believing scientists tell us that the word kind, by the way, we all believe in true science here. Nobody disputes that at all. I said true science. We'll talk about that later on. Bible-believing scientists tell us that the word kind in Genesis is not the same as our word species today. That's a scientific classification that people have come up with in recent years compared to Genesis. It's not the same term. It's a different term. But kind is a broader term. But plants and trees have their own unique DNA and genetic information. That's interesting. The subject of DNA is interesting. Everybody has their own peculiar DNA, and no different for plants and trees. So because of this, plant life logically produces what? Plant life, right? Trees logically reproduce trees, and not to say there can't be hybrids, there can be. For example, in 1881, a judge in California crossed a raspberry with a blackberry. By the way, what do you get when you cross a raspberry with a blackberry? You get a loganberry. It's not a joke. It's actually true. The guy did it and came up with what they call a loganberry, which exists today. And there can be hybrids, but the loganberry was still a plant. Even though they crossed these plants, they're still a plant. And so God sets boundaries on reproduction. And plants reproduce other plants. For example, plants and trees will never produce animal offspring. Not going to happen. So the evolutionary models are incorrect, actually. Each produces after its kind. Now, there are many scientists who are creationists also. And you can look into that. You can see that on the websites. Let me quote one, Henry Morris, on the subject. There are many more. Henry Morris says this: everything we know about the Earth's flora, the plant life, everything we know about the Earth's flora verifies the basic statements of Genesis. Grass produces grass. Another word for vegetation is grass. And does not produce fruit trees. Fig trees don't produce grapes. Everything works just as God designed it to do and told us that it would do. Evolutionary science may imagine and spin sophisticated stories of how dirt becomes grass, but there's never been, listen to this, never been a scientific paper describing an observation of such a thing happening ever. Never. Now, you know what's interesting? I was studying this. I was thinking of the words of Jesus, strangely enough. Even Jesus, in a reference to false prophets, in Matthew 7:16, Jesus says this in Matthew 7:16. He says, you will know them by their fruits. You'll know the false prophets by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, are they? Nor are figs gathered from thistles, are they? Thistles is a prickly plant. Try to say that 5 times in a row. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, are they? Nor figs from thistles. No, they're not. Isn't it just common sense? A thorn bush is not going to produce grapes. A thistle will not produce figs. Why? Because it's always after its kind. You produce after your kind. Fig trees produce fig trees, and so on. Figs, figs, and it goes on like that. So even Jesus, not even intending to talk about this subject at all, throws this in. There's also been the objection that the Bible can't be correct, possibly be correct, because you can't have plants until you have a sun. The sun hasn't been created yet. This is day 3. There's no sun, so you can't have these plants. But is there not already a light shining in day 1? It says that, right? And that light could produce heat. If God wanted it to act like a sort of a sun, it could. It doesn't say that. But there was light already. At any rate, God is happy with the results of the 3rd day. He saw that it was good, it says. There was evening and there was morning the 3rd day. Let's go to day 4, verses 14 and 19. This is actually our last day we're going to talk about today. Verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, and there was morning, a 4th day. Let me ask the kids a question, by the way. All the kids listening? How many days did God take to create the earth? The little kids, especially. 6? That's right. That's what it says. This is the 4th day we're on. On the 4th day, God lights it up big time, doesn't he? On the 1st day, in verse 3, God said, let there be light. On the 4th day, God said, let there be lights, plural. And that's what happened. So how does the light on day 1 relate to the light on day 4? How does that relate? I can only assume that the light from day 1 is no longer needed, since it's replaced by the sun, moon, and stars. In verse 14, God says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven." The word lights here means luminaries or light bearers or light holders. These light bearers include the sun, moon, and stars. They give off light that can be observed. You see this. What does your mother tell you when you're growing up? Don't look into the sun. And so what do? You look into the sun because she told you not to, right? Don't do that. Listen, don't do this. Don't try this at home, all right? Don't look into the sun or anytime, wherever you're at. Bright lights, Ezekiel 32:8 uses that same term, and it talks about all the bright lights of heaven, all the shining lights of heaven. Even the Apostle Paul uses this passage, uses Genesis 1 more than once. The Apostle Paul does in the New Testament to illustrate a spiritual truth. It's a truth concerning the glorified body that we're going to receive one day when we go to be with the Lord. What chapter is this found in? 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection chapter. And it says in 1 Corinthians 15:41, a very interesting statement. Paul's arguing about the glorified body versus the body we have now, body of death we have now. And he says, "There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars." And then this fascinating phrase, if anybody wants to study it thoroughly, "For star differs from star in glory." And the Apostle Paul the point he's making in 1 Corinthians 15 is just as God has suited the lights of heaven, stars, moon, and sun, for their environment, so he can design a glorified body for the believer when he's with the Lord. He can make us suitable for heaven. He can make believers suitable for heaven. 1 Corinthians chapter 15:41, I think I have that verse on your notes. So Paul uses this illustration of the lights from Genesis 1 to illustrate this New Testament truth to believers. Now we're talking about the God of creation who created these lights for our good and his glory. But one thing you can learn about human nature, what happens with humans? We pervert everything God does, right? We try to pervert it. We try to mess it up. We misuse it. So, the Gentiles back in the Old Testament times who did not know God, you know what they thought the lights in heaven were? All of them. Babylonians, you name the Assyria, everybody, you name them back then, Sumerians. They considered the lights in heavens to be gods. And they talk about it in historical literature you can read. They worship those lights in heavens as gods. They worship the sun, moon, and stars. For example, the Egyptians had their sun god. I think it was Re. Not Ray, like Ray Comfort, but they called the sun god Re. The people of Ur, where Abraham came from, they worshiped the moon god. Did you know that? The Babylonians had a trinity of stars they worshipped, and all these cultures worshipped all kinds of gods in the heavens. So, instead of worshiping the God who created these lights, they worshiped the lights themselves, and they perverted it. And that happens all the time with human beings. Whatever God makes, whatever he institutes, we end up perverting. This became such a temptation for the nation of Israel in the Old Testament that God warned them against this kind of idolatry. And he says in Deuteronomy 4:19, "Beware, my people, beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the hosts of heaven." That's all the stars of heaven probably. And if you do that and you're drawn away and you worship them and serve them, beware that doesn't happen. Don't worship them. Don't serve them. Those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. So God made this possible for everybody to have these luminaries in the sky. Don't let that be your God, he says. I made that. In fact, the penalty for such idolatry was death. Deuteronomy 17:3. If anyone, God says, has gone and served other gods and worshiped them, or he's worshiped the sun or the moon or any of the heavenly hosts, which I have not commanded, that person should be stoned to death. That's how serious it was. Now, there are many people today caught up in astrology, not astronomy, the science, but astrology and horoscopes and all that. That's all a perversion of what God intended. So what's Genesis 1:14 and 19 teaching us? It's teaching us that God rules the heavens and the earth. There's something higher than the planets and the stars. It's God who created them. That's what we're talking about here. Now, why did he create these lights? Why did God create these lights? The reasons are given in these verses. Number one, he did it to divide day from night, verse 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of heavens to separate the day from the night. Separate or divide or make a distinction, the word means, between the day and the night. In verse 16, it says God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, that's the sun. The lesser light to govern the night, that's the moon. Now, when it says they govern, the sun and moon govern or rule, the word is also, the day and night, it doesn't mean that the sun and moon rule as sovereign gods. It's not talking about that like the Gentiles thought back then. It's not talking about that. It just means they govern in an astronomical sense, not in any other sense. They govern only in that capacity. John Calvin said this, the sun is still a servant and the moon a handmaid. In other words, Calvin said the sun is God's servant, the moon is God's servant, and that's it. Nothing more than that. And they just work in their capacity. That's all it has to do with. They're not deities. The sun gives off light, the moon reflects that light, and that's all they do. Now, it's not the purpose of Genesis 1 to detail all scientific data, as I said already, relating to creation. You know, God has put it into the hearts of people throughout history to discover facts about science, not fiction. There's a lot of fiction going on in science in the name of science. He put it in the hearts of people like Isaac Newton and many other people to discover the facts about science. Proverbs 25:2 says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter. So God expects us to study and research and study and learn all this stuff. He expects that. Now let me ask you a question. How many people, we're talking about day and night, how many people here would be happy if every day was like daylight saving time 24 hours a day, never any night? Would you like that? Just day, 24 hours a day. Would you like that? Or would you like, what if we only had night and no day? Would you like that? Well, both are necessary. You have to, God's wisely made both of these on purpose. Years ago, my family and I had the opportunity to go to Alaska. And I discovered that the biggest, this is my 10-day visit to Alaska. I discovered in my 10 days there that the biggest activity in Alaska was fishing. Everybody was fishing. That's all they talked about was fishing. Fishing was all over the place. Everybody was fishing. We went fishing. We went combat fishing, as a matter of fact. Remember this, Stephen? Stephen was there. Combat fishing, they call it. That's where you stand in a river side by side with 1 million people all across, and you do fly fishing like this. You cast one after another, and you're just a ton of guys next to each other. Where do we fish at, Stephen? Tell me the whole phrase. You didn't remember this? I can never forget this. We fished in the confluence of the Kenai and Russian rivers, okay? This is area where the Kenai and Russian rivers meet called the confluence. It's a very popular fishing spot. Everybody goes there to fish. They fish for salmon. There was a guy there with a table in the river. You would love this place, Luke. He's a fisherman. There was a guy there with a table in the river, in the middle of the river, low there where he was, cutting up the salmon on the table that people had caught, and it looked like a salmon slaughterhouse. I'm telling you, there were salmon carcasses all over that river, and there we were fishing. Now, you would have thought it was broad daylight, but it was actually 2 o'clock in the morning. And we were out there fishing. You could, just like it is right now, you could, in daylight, you could see everything clearly, and no night at all. You know, when you're in Alaska in the summer, you have to close the curtains when you go to bed. You have to say, it's time to go to sleep now because it's going to stay daylight all night, and for a while at least. And you have to, you're never going to get any sleep. I literally realized, you thought it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. No, it's 11 o'clock at night. It's still daylight outside. So they close their curtains, say at 11 o'clock at night, time to go to bed, everybody, go to bed. It's actually nighttime. You're not going to sleep otherwise. But that's a temporary situation in Alaska, not the whole year. But what a blessing it is to have nighttime to sleep. Otherwise, you're going to be a wreck unless you work the graveyard shift, and then you have to work all night. And I did that. Never good. And so God has wisely made it as such that there's a day and there's a night. There's light and darkness. You need both. He made it that way on purpose. And so, why did God create the lights? To divide the day from the night. Secondly, why did he create it? To mark the passing of time. Verse 14. Again, God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs, he says, for signs. For seasons, for days and years, for signs. Now, we know that over the centuries, sailors, when they were out there on the oceans, before they had all this modern technology, they would have just in fact, they could use the stars to guide them on their way. And that's what they did, to navigate through the ocean. But we're talking here not about that. We're talking about signs in the sense of identifiers or markers to indicate the passing of time. Because these have to do with seasons and days and years. These signs, stars are acting like that. They guide our calendar. They mark the seasons. For example, the moon in orbit around the earth determines the months of the year, doesn't it? Psalm 104:19 says, God, listen to this, God made the moon for the seasons, he says. The moon regulates the tides of the oceans. I feel like I should teach your science class, Grace. She just became a science teacher. I'm not a science teacher, but I feel like one right now. The heavenly lights mark the days and the years also. The sun determines the days. The tilt of the earth on its axis is such that the sun shines on different parts of the earth throughout the year. This is all amazing. This is beyond us, really, how all this works together. It's absolutely, the tilt of the earth, the rotation, the distance of the sun from the earth, perfect. Everything's in perfect balance for life on this planet. The 24-hour cycle of day and night, the orbit of the planets, all due to our Creator. So, as a result of this, we're able to set our clocks and mark the calendar. Oh, on June 4th, I got to do this. Why is there going to be a June 4th? Yeah, because God's made it this way. We can do all these things. We can live a scheduled, orderly life. It's amazing. He did this to mark the passing of time. A third reason for putting these lights in the sky is to illuminate. Verse 15. Let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and it was so. The sun gives us light and energy in the day. The moon gives light by night. And so whatever way the Lord, why he did the light on the first day is no longer in effect. The heavenly celestial bodies will be the light source from now on, and we could fill hours and hours discussing the sun and the moon. Those are amazing subjects that would demand all kinds of study. But there's one more heavenly light we need to mention before we quit tonight. That's the end of verse 16. Look at the end of verse 16. He made the stars also. You see that last phrase? He made the stars also. It literally just says, in Hebrew, it just says, and the stars. It just says, and the stars. Like an afterthought almost. Oh, by the way, I made the stars. That's all it says. Now, that's called an economy of words. The Lord says a mouthful in just a handful of words. And the stars. Why do I say that? Because the stars are such a vast subject that certain astronomers give their whole lives to studying just the stars. There's a lot of subjects, subcategories within astronomy, and they will give their lives studying one subcategory. My brother is actually an astronomer and a scientist. I talked to him yesterday to ask him this question. I'd heard him mention he studies binary stars. Binary stars are two-star system that orbit each other. And I said, so how long have you been studying binary stars? Like a couple of years? Oh, no. I've been studying this for over 30 years. 30 years? He said, this is just one tiny area of astronomy. And he says, I only study there's all kinds of binary stars. I only study the solar star, the one type called the solar star. That's it, for 30 years. And so you see the vast creation God has made in the realm of the stars. It's just unending. And it's the binary stars, by the way, a little scientific note here, he told me. It's the binary stars that help us understand all stars. But this is just one study in this whole vast area of astronomy that's absolutely phenomenal. I remember when we were growing up, he used to have a telescope. I had the football. He had the telescope. I was throwing the football. Hey, come over here and look at the telescope. I'd rather throw the football. And so I'd go look at the stars with him every once in a while. Then go back to throwing the football. There are actually billions of stars in each of there's billions of galaxies, first of all. And there's billions of stars in each of the billions of galaxies. This is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. And each star, my brother told me yesterday, has its own personality, he said. That was his words. That shows the intricate nature of God's creation. An innumerable amount of stars, each with its own personality. Now, we think of children like that. Well, each of my children have their own personality. That's true. But this is the way the stars are. Now, nobody can know how many stars there are. Can you count the stars? Jeffrey, can you count the stars? Excuse me, Dr. West? No, nobody can. But God knows. Psalm 147 even says God counts the number of the stars. God counts them. He gives names to all of them. Not only does he count them, he names each one of them. Can you imagine having billions and billions and billions of children? What's their names? It'd be like George Foreman, call them all George. Yeah. I thought he had 5 children, but whatever it was. They were all named George. Now, do you know there are companies that will name a star after you? For a fee, of course. You can pay them, they'll name a star after you. Only the visible stars, though. Only the ones you can see. They'll name it after you. But I thought, isn't that breaking a copyright law of some kind? Because they're already named. God named them all. Every single, even the ones you can't see. The ones you can see, he named them all. I don't know what names he gave them, but maybe, what if he gave them children's names? Like, what if he said, this one is Josh, this one is Faith, this one is Autumn, this one is Joel, that one's Samuel. It's kind of out of orbit. What if this one's Lucy, this one's Joel? What if he did that? What, this one's Bree? I wanted to work you in there, Bree. Isaiah, I don't know what he named them, but he's got all kinds of names for all these stars. Isaiah 40, verses 25 and 26 says this, lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars. The one who leads forth their host by number, he calls them all by name. That's what he does. Because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one of them is missing. I call that no star left behind. Not one of them is missing. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 25 and 26. What's the verdict on this part of creation? We'll close this with this for tonight. Verses 18 and 19. God saw that it was good. He looked at his work, looked at the stars, looked at the sun, looked at the moon, and said, this is good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. God's power, we're talking about God's power. It's unlimited, it's unmatched, and creation shows us clearly how powerful our God is. We'll pick it up next week with day 5. Let's close in prayer. Father, we're grateful again for your word, and we pray you'll help us to understand and believe and receive your truth, and help us to live by the word that you've given us, Lord, knowing that you're an all-powerful God. We can trust you. We can depend on you. We can count on you for all things. And we're thankful for that. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.